The spine holding you upright at this moment would collapse in less than a second without the muscles surrounding it. Researchers have measured the compressive load a human spine can bear without muscular support. The weight of your head alone exceeds it. Without the muscles firing at this moment, the flexible rod running through your torso would buckle under the mass of your own skull before you finished reading this sentence. Consider the difference between a flagpole and a fishing rod. A flagpole is a rigid column. It stands upright through the compressive strength of its material. Apply a lateral force and the material resists until it fractures. A fishing rod is a flexible rod. It bends under any lateral force, stores energy in its curvature, and returns to neutral when the force releases. Your spine behaves like the fishing rod, not the flagpole. It bends, it twists, it stores elastic energy, and it returns to neutral, but only if external tension maintains the neutral it returns to. Without the guy wires, the fishing rod collapses under its own weight. The flagpole stands alone. Your spine cannot. It is a flexible rod, 33 vertebrae separated by deformable discs that allow bending, twisting, and compression in every direction. A flexible rod cannot support load through rigidity. It supports load through tension. External cables pulling from multiple directions, creating the stiffness the rod cannot generate on its own. In 1510, Leonardo da Vinci drew the muscles of the human spine and labeled them as rigging on a ship's mast. The drawing survives in the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle. Muscle fibers drawn as cables radiating from vertebral segments to the pelvis and skull, annotated in mirror writing with notes on tension and support. Leonardo was an engineer before he was an anatomist. He saw the spine as an engineering challenge, 500 years before the biomechanics laboratories that would prove him right. He understood 500 years ago that the spine follows identical engineering as a sailing vessel, a tall, flexible mast held upright by guy wires pulling from every direction. Loosen one wire and the mast does not lean gradually, it buckles at a single point. The engineering holding your torso upright, 30 or more muscles pulling in coordinated tension against a flexible rod, is identical to the engineering of a mast in a crosswind. And the engineering failure that produces back pain follows identical physics. Intervertebral disc is what makes the spine flexible rather than rigid. A gel core wrapped in layered collagen, a pressurized deformable cushion, allowing the vertebrae above and below to move relative to each other. This deformability gives the spine its extraordinary range of motion, the ability to flex, extend, rotate, and bend laterally through a range no rigid column could achieve. But deformability is the opposite of compressive strength. A deformable joint cannot resist compressive load the way a rigid joint can. Stack 33 vertebrae with 23 deformable discs between them. Stand the structure upright. Apply the weight of a human head, approximately 5 kilograms. The structure collapses. Add the arms, the shoulders, the rib cage, 30 to 40 kilograms above the lumbar spine. The structure buckles at the weakest disc before the load reaches the pelvis. The isolated spine bears approximately 9 kilograms before mechanical failure. The human torso weighs 4 times that. The spine cannot hold up the body it runs through. 9 kilograms. The weight of a large bag of flour. That is the entire compressive capacity of the structure running through your torso. The guy wire system must provide the structural integrity the rod itself lacks. Spinal muscles attaching to the spine are not what you think they are. You have been taught to think of muscles as movers. The bicep lifts the arm, the quadricep extends the knee. The spinal muscles are not primarily movers. They are structural tension cables whose primary job is to stiffen a flexible rod so it does not collapse under load. The erector spinae running vertically along the posterior spine, the quadratus lumborum from the last rib to the pelvis, the 3 layers of abdominal wall wrapping the anterior and lateral torso, the multifidus connecting vertebrae deep against the spine, psoas running from the lumbar vertebrae to the femur. Each one is a guy wire pulling from a specific angle on a specific segment of the mast. When all the guy wires pull in coordinated tension, the flexible rod becomes a stiff, load-bearing structure. The stiffness does not come from the spine. It comes from the cables surrounding it. The spine is the mast, the muscles are the rigging, and the pelvis is the hull. The muscles holding you upright at this moment are not moving anything. They are pulling from 30 directions simultaneously, preventing the mast from buckling. Intra-abdominal pressure, the balloon discussion described, operates alongside this guy wire system. Hydraulic support from the front, muscular tension from every other direction. 2 engineering systems working simultaneously to stiffen a rod that cannot stiffen itself. Now, The stiffness curve, because when a muscle contracts, it creates two things at once, and they do not scale at an equivalent rate. When a muscle contracts, it creates force. This is understood. What is less understood is that the contraction simultaneously creates stiffness, a resistance to deformation that the joint uses for stability rather than movement. Force and stiffness do not increase at the same rate. Force increases approximately linearly with muscle activation. 50%. Activation produces roughly 50% of maximum force. Stiffness follows a different curve, an asymptotic function that rises rapidly at low activation levels and plateaus below 50% of maximum activation. At low muscle activation, relaxed sitting, gentle movement, force is low and stiffness is low. The joint has minimal resistance to perturbation. A small unexpected force can exceed the available stiffness and cause a micro movement at the joint. At maximum activation, a heavy deadlift, a maximal squat, force peaks. But stiffness plateaued long before the force reached its maximum. The force being transmitted through the spine can overpower the controlling stiffness and cause a micro movement in the opposite direction. Not from too little tension, but from too much force, exceeding the stiffness ceiling. The mast buckling in a hurricane, guy wires fully tensioned, but the wind exceeds their capacity. Safest operating range is the middle, moderate activation where stiffness is near its maximum relative to force. The asymptotic curve explains two common experiences. First, why your back goes out during trivial tasks. Picking up a pen from the floor, reaching for a seatbelt, turning to check a blind spot, loads that weigh ounces causing pain that lasts weeks. At low activation, relaxed reaching, casual bending, stiffness is at its minimum. The trivial load exceeds the minimal stiffness. The mast buckles under a breeze you would never call a storm. Second, why the powerlifter who can deadlift 300 kilograms herniates a disc at 250. The force exceeded the stiffness ceiling even at maximum activation. Both injuries follow the asymptotic curve. Both are engineering failures at different points on the same graph. This asymptotic relationship is the engineering principle behind every spinal rehabilitation protocol worth following. Train the guy wires to hold moderate tension consistently rather than maximum tension occasionally. Moderate tension, sustained. That is the engineering specification for a healthy spine. Now, the buckling, because what happens when one guy wire loses tension for one fraction of a second has been captured on real-time X-ray. In the 1990s, a laboratory at the University of Waterloo performed an experiment that had never been attempted. Real-time X-ray cameras, video fluoroscopy, were placed on competitive powerlifters lifting maximal loads, filming the spine from the inside as the lift occurred. Every individual joint was calibrated, the normal excursion of each vertebral segment measured from full flexion to full extension. Then a lift that produced an injury was filmed, as Kolowicki and McGill captured in Clinical Biomechanics, documenting the first spine buckling event in the medical literature. One joint, the second and third lumbar vertebrae, moved past its calibrated range by half a degree. The joints above did not move, the joints below did not move. The entire injury occurred at a single point in the mast, where one guy wire lost tension for a fraction of a second. Half a degree of excess movement at one joint, one moment of insufficient stiffness. The mechanism was a structural engineering failure, a loss of stiffness at one joint, allowing a micro movement that exceeded the tissue tolerance at that single point. Back pain that seems to move, one day on the right side, the next radiating to the left hip, the next week shooting down the leg. You may be experiencing a buckle at a single unstable joint. The pain migrates because the micro-movement direction changes with different postures and loads. The source is one point in the mast. The guy wire that should be stabilizing it is providing inadequate tension. Half a degree, one joint, one fraction of a second, that is how precisely the engineering operates and how precisely it fails. My morning stiffness reframed the day I understood the guy wire model. Cables that lost tension overnight and needed reloading before the mast could bear the day's demands. The stiffness that felt like something breaking was something rebuilding. The guy wires re-establishing tension after hours of sleep-reduced muscle tone left the mast unsupported. During sleep, muscle tone drops to its lowest level. The guy wires go slack. The discs, freed from compressive loading, absorb fluid from the surrounding tissue and swell slightly, which is why you are measurably taller in the morning than in the evening. The swollen discs are more vulnerable to bending loads because the increased fluid pressure reduces their tolerance for flexion. The morning back that feels stiff and fragile is amassed with slack guy wires and swollen discs, the engineering at its most vulnerable. The worst thing you can do in the first hour after waking is bend forward under load because the guy wires have not re-established tension and the discs have not yet lost their overnight fluid accumulation. 10 minutes of gentle isometric loading and the stiffness resolved, the mast stiffened, and the back that felt fragile at 6 in the morning felt reliable by 6:15. Disc that separates each vertebra follows the laws of textile science rather than the laws of rubber. Intervertebral disc is not a rubber washer. It is a fabric, layer upon layer of collagen fibers arranged in concentric rings, each layer oriented at approximately 30 degrees to the horizontal, alternating direction with each layer. The architecture is identical to the weave of a textile. Structural fibers held together by binding matrix, strength coming from the pattern rather than any individual fiber. Strength of a fabric depends not on the strength of individual fibers but on the bonds holding them together. Type 1 collagen, the structural fiber, is immensely strong. The binding collagen between structural fibers is where genetic variability lives and where failure begins. To delaminate a fabric, you do not need to break a fiber. You need to work the fibers apart, repeated stress-strain reversals loosening the bonds between them. Disc delaminates through this physics, as Callaghan and McGill documented in clinical biomechanics, demonstrating that repeated loaded flexion extension cycles produced disc herniation through progressive fiber separation rather than sudden rupture. Repeated bending under load creates stress-strain reversals in the collagen layers. The binding collagen loosens, the layers separate. The gel nucleus, pressurized at the center, seeks the path of least resistance through the delaminated layers and migrates outward. A disc bulge forms, not from a single catastrophic event, but from a fabric slowly coming apart at the seams under repeated mechanical stress. If you have seen your MRI and been told you have a disc bulge, the image shows the disc wall pushed outward, sometimes contacting the nerve root behind it. You are looking at a delamination. The layers of collagen fabric that should be holding the gel nucleus in place have separated enough for the pressurized gel to push through. The bulge is not the disc wearing out from age. It is the fabric coming apart at the seams from repeated, bending under load. The same physics that separates the layers of a car tire when the sidewall wall flexes through too many potholes. The engineering is reversible if the delamination has not progressed to full rupture. The collagen can rebond if the mechanical stimulus changes from delamination producing repeated loaded flexion to repair promoting. Isometric holds that squeeze repair substrates into the tissue. You now know the mast, the guy wires, the stiffness curve, the buckling physics, and the fabric that delaminates under repeated stress. The question changes from the engineering of how the spine fails to the engineering of how it transmits force, protects itself, and rebuilds. Proximal distal transfer next, because the mast's stiffness determines how effectively your limbs can generate force. Pectoral major, the chest muscle producing a pushing force, crosses the shoulder joint. When it contracts, the distal end pushes the arm forward, but the proximal end pulls the rib cage toward the shoulder. If the core is not stiffened, the muscle collapses the torso into the shoulder instead of pushing the arm forward. The push leaks into self-compression. The force you intended for the door handle or the jar lid dissipates into a mast that flexed instead of transmitting. A stiffened core arrests the proximal collapse. The rib cage does not move. The full contraction directs force distally, into the arm, into the push. The same muscle, identical neural drive, but dramatically more effective force delivery, because the mast was stiffened before the rigging was loaded. McGill measured world-class athletes after stabilization training. Performance increased without any change in limb muscle size. Core stiffness increased. The stiffer mast made the existing guy wires more effective at transmitting force to the limbs. If you struggle with a heavy door, if your grip feels weaker than it should, if your arms do not produce the force you expect, the problem may not be in the arms. A flexible rod between the hand and the ground leaks force at every joint it passes through. Stiffen the rod and the same hand produces more effective force at the jar lid without any change in grip strength. Pulling follows identical physics. Lifting a bag of groceries from the floor requires force transmission from the hand, through the arm, through the core to the ground. If the core flexes under the load, the lifting force that should travel straight down through a stiffened mast dissipates into spinal flexion. The movement pattern that delaminates disc fabric. The person who threw their back out picking up groceries experienced a transmission failure. The force was adequate, the mast was not stiffened, and the load delaminated the fabric at the point where the rod bent instead of transmitting. Engineering explains why physiotherapists prescribe core stiffness exercises for shoulder pain, hip pain, and knee pain, conditions that seem unrelated to the spine. Every limb force transmits through the core. A stiff core transmits efficiently, the force reaches the limb. A flexible core absorbs inefficiently, the force dissipates before it arrives. The shoulder that aches during overhead reaching may be compensating for a mast that flexes during the reach, forcing the shoulder to generate additional stabilization force it was never designed to provide. Stiffen the mast and the shoulder's compensatory workload drops. The pain resolves, not through shoulder treatment, but through spinal engineering. And then the end plate, because the weakest link in the mast is not where most people assume. Vertebral end plate, the thin layer of bone capping the top and bottom of each vertebral body, is the weakest structure in the spinal column under compressive load. In 2025, researchers analyzing surgically removed disc herniations found that more than half of the specimens contained fragments of broken end plate embedded in the extruded disc material. As Eisler and colleagues discovered in the Spine Journal, the fragments were not from the herniation event itself. They were from a prior compression overload, a heavy lift, a fall, an impact that fractured the end plate and compromised the seal between the vertebral body and the disc nucleus. Once the end plate fractures, the pressurized gel seeps vertically through the fracture into the vertebral body. The disc loses height. Loss of height slackens the annular fibers, like a tire losing pressure. The slackened fibers bulge outward. The disc bulge on your MRI may have started not with the disc but with the end plate, a compression fracture that broke the seal and allowed the nucleus to escape into the bone above. End plate is bone. Bone adapts to loading through Wolff's law, but bone adaptation is slow. Muscle adapts in weeks, tendon in months. Bone requires months to years of progressive loading to increase its density. The person who goes from sedentary to heavy deadlifting in 6 months has built muscle strength that dramatically exceeds their bone strength. The muscles can generate the force the end plate cannot withstand, and the weakest link fails. Bone is the weakest link, and bone is the slowest tissue to adapt. Well, the brain's response, because what happens neurologically when the mast buckles explains the weakness you have been attributing to aging. When the brain detects instability at a spinal joint, a micromovement, a shear the guy wires failed to arrest. It does not increase neural drive to fix the problem. It decreases neural drive. The brain reduces the force output of every muscle in the chain, as Panjabi defined in the Journal of Spinal Disorders, establishing the neutral zone concept and the neural response to spinal instability. Response is protective. If the mast is buckling at one point, adding more tension to the guy wires increases the load on the buckling point. The brain's strategy: reduce total force so the unstable joint is not loaded past its remaining stiffness. You experience this as weakness, the inability to generate force you sense you should be capable of. The muscles are intact. The neural drive is being withheld, feeling weaker than you should. If you sense that the muscles are present but the force does not arrive, you may be experiencing neural drive inhibition. From a joint the brain has flagged as unstable. The weakness is protection, not failure. Restore the stiffness at that joint, and the neural drive returns. The brain releases the brake because the mast is stable again. For anyone doing back exercises without improvement, the muscles may already be strong enough. The brain is withholding the drive. The exercise that addresses this is not a strengthening exercise. It is a stiffening exercise, an isometric hold at the specific joint angle where the instability lives, rebuilding the stiffness that signals the brain to release the drive. Strengthening a muscle the brain refuses to fully activate produces frustration. Stiffening the joint the brain flagged as unstable produces resolution. The brain is not the enemy. It is the engineer, protecting a structure it cannot trust until you give it reason to trust again. My back regained its confidence through 3 daily isometric holds after a decade of feeling unreliable. Engineering restoring tension to cables that had been slack since a buckling event nobody diagnosed. The holds did not build muscle. They restored stiffness at the unstable joint, and the brain responded by releasing the neural drive it had been withholding. The force returned. The confidence followed. The engineering was always intact. The brain was waiting for proof that the mast could bear load before allowing the muscles to produce it. Every tissue in the spine needs stress, but the margin between building and breaking is narrower than most training programs assume. Every biological tissue requires mechanical stress for optimal health. Below the tipping point, stress is anabolic, building tissue, increasing resilience, stimulating adaptation. Above the tipping point, stress is catabolic, accumulating microtrauma, degrading tissue, creating injury. The disc fabric can tolerate moderate loading and moderate movement indefinitely. The injuries occur when high load combines with high mobility, the combination that produces the stress-strain reversals that delaminate the fabric. Rate of progression determines whether the load stays below the tipping point. A 10% increase per week allows full biological adaptation, muscle, tendon, collagen, and bone keeping pace with increasing demand. A step change, a sudden jump in load or volume, bridges the gap between what the muscles can produce and what the end plate can withstand. The muscles adapt in weeks, the bone adapts in months. The step change is where the engineering fails. The gardener who spent the winter sedentary and digs the entire garden bed on the first warm Saturday. The muscles can handle the load, but the discs and end plates have not adapted to the sustained flexion under load. The grandparent who picks up a growing child from the floor using a flexed spine. The load exceeds the end plate's current tolerance, even though the muscles generate it easily. Solution is not avoiding load. The spine needs load to maintain its structural integrity. The discs need compression for fluid exchange. The disc has no blood supply and receives all its nutrition through mechanical pumping of fluid from the vertebral body through the end plate, identical to the imbibition principle that feeds cartilage throughout the body. A disc that receives no compressive loading receives no nutrition and degrades from starvation rather than overuse. The vertebral bone needs compressive stress for density maintenance. Through Fulf's law, the guy wires need tension to maintain their contractile capacity. The solution is matching the rate of load increase to the rate of biological adaptation. Build the muscles in weeks, then wait for the bones and collagen to follow in months. The engineering fails when the fast-adapting tissues outpace the slow-adapting tissues. If back pain arrives with fever, bowel or bladder changes, progressive numbness in both legs, or follows a significant impact, that is a medical emergency requiring immediate physician evaluation. For the majority of back pain, the mechanical kind that worsens with certain postures and eases with others, that fluctuates with activity and time of day, that has been present for months or years without aggressive neurological deterioration. The engineering model applies. The pain has a mechanical trigger, a structural explanation, and a movement-based solution. The engineering model applies to mechanical back pain, which is the vast majority of cases. Pathological causes, infection, tumor, fracture, cauda equina syndrome, require medical intervention the engineering model does not address. And then, the restoration, because the guy wires that lost tension can regain it through a specific loading strategy that addresses stiffness without crossing the tipping point. Isometric contraction, holding a muscle at a fixed length under tension without movement, is the engineering solution. The isometric hold creates stiffness at the joint without creating movement through the joint. The unstable segment is stabilized without being loaded through its painful micro-movement range. The guy wire pulls without the mast bending, holds simultaneously, squeezes inflammatory fluid from the collagenous tissues around the joint. When the hold releases, fresh fluid with repair substrates flows back in. As Barr demonstrated at the University of California, showing that this squeeze and release cycle through isometric hold stimulates collagen synthesis in tendons and ligaments, the collagenous tissues forming the disc annulus and spinal joint capsules. Hold also retrains the brain's motor pattern. Neural drive that was inhibited by instability detection begins returning as the brain registers that the joint is stable during the hold. Each hold signals the brain, this joint is stiffened, you can release the brake. Neural drive increases incrementally with each session. Hold duration, 8 to 12 seconds. Under 5 seconds does not sustain enough compression for the fluid exchange. Over 30 seconds fatigues the stabilizing muscles and allows the micro-movement to return. 3 holds per position. 3 squeeze and release cycles producing measurable collagen synthesis stimulation. Residual stiffness from the holds lasts approximately 20 minutes. A window of enhanced stability during which you can move with less pain and more confidence. 3 positions load the front, side, and back of the mast independently. A posterior diagonal hold with opposite arm and leg extended while the core prevents rotation. A lateral hold in a side-supported position challenging the lateral guy wires. And an anterior hold with the shoulders elevated isometrically while the lumbar spine maintains its neutral curve. Posterior diagonal hold from hands and knees. Extend the right arm forward and the left leg backward while preventing the torso from rotating or the lumbar spine from extending. The challenge is not the arm or leg extension, it is the core preventing the mast from twisting under the asymmetric load. Hold 8 to 12 seconds, then switch sides for 3 repetitions per side. Lateral hold. Lie on your sides, supported on the forearm and the knees, not the feet. The knee-supported version halves the spinal compression while preserving the lateral guy wire challenge. Lift the hips to create a straight line from shoulders to knees. Hold 8 to 12 seconds, 3 repetitions per side. Anterior hold. Lie face down, forearms on the floor. Lift the torso until the shoulders clear the ground by 5 to 10 centimeters. Not a full plank, which loads the spine excessively, but a modified hold that challenges the anterior guy wires at a fraction of the compressive cost. Hold 8 to 12 seconds, 3 repetitions. Each position loads 1 set of cables at a time, half the spinal compression of exercises loading all sides simultaneously. The mast receives enough tension to arrest micro movements. The disc receives less compression than the tipping point permits. The brain receives evidence that the joint is stable. You feel it within the first session. The back that felt locked up, or weak or unreliable, has more stiffness, more confidence, more willingness to bear the loads of daily life. The 20 minutes following the holds is the training window, the interval during which daily movements that previously triggered pain can be performed under the protection of enhanced stability. Walking during this window, reaching during this window, bending carefully during this window teaches the brain that these movements are safe when the mast is stiffened. The neural drive updates during protected movement, not during the hold itself, but during the movement the hold made possible. The feeling is not placebo. It is the residual stiffness from the isometric holds, reducing the micro movement that was triggering the neural drive inhibition. The brain detected stability, the brake released, and the force returned. 500 years separate the drawing and the fluoroscopy. Leonardo drew the rigging in 1510. A laboratory in Ontario filmed the buckling in the 1990s. The engineering was always the same, a flexible rod that needs guy wires to bear load, a brain that refuses to power a structure it cannot trust. The guy wires are intact, the mast is intact, and the engineering works. It always did.